Let's start with China. There are a few things happening, right? That the two sessions
Mm,
and the two sessions, a lot of domestic things, but for international, Wang Yi had a press conference, and in there he made it very
yeah.
clear that Taiwan is being called the Taiwan province in the United Nations, which is has been, a long time being called so. But for some reason, when he said that, it got lots of attention. And the other thing is the Chinese foreign minister recently was answering the question regarding the tariff war. And here's what they said. First, they answered it in the during the conference, and then later the Chinese embassy in the U.S. posted this and said that if the war is what the U.S. wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we are ready to fight till the end. And I think that's got a lot of attention. I'm sure you paid attention to this, that many media see that as a very, tough talk and stuff like that, a little bit unusual, I guess, still for the West media to to hear that. So there's speculations, okay, China now is really tough and not afraid of having a direct war with the US, etc. What is your take on this whole thing?
Well, it's exactly the same as what the Chinese have always been saying. I mean, it always amazes me when people talk about Chinese being tough and Chinese being aggressive. I mean, on the subject of being aggressive, because some people are treating that as a very aggressive statement, and there's lots of comments and commentaries that I've been reading about what an aggressive statement that was. Are you kidding me? Just read what Western officials say about China every day, and you're going to call this aggressive? I mean, it's so completely uh, wrong. And note it is not saying that China is looking
Uh-huh.
for
Hmm.
a war. It is saying that if a war of any kind, trade war, tariff war, any sort of war, is imposed on China, then China will resist. That's all it's saying.
Hmm.
Now, what is objectionable about that? I don't find this is. I don't find this is. I mean, it's only a strong statement,
Hmm.
but it's the kind of statement you would expect China to make, given the kind of pressures that are being placed upon it. It is the United States that's talking about tariffs on China.
Hmm.
It's the United States that's been talking about economic wars. It's the fact economic war is now being talked about all over the West, not just by the West against China, but by parts of the West against each other. And if we're talking about Taiwan, well, it's the West that harps on the question of Taiwan all the time and will not leave it alone. So
Hmm.
here is the Chinese are saying, look, if we're not looking for a fight, but if you come after us, we're ready. That's
Yeah.
all.
Yeah, I also feel like but they always seems horrified and stunned by these kind of statement. Sorry.
Yeah.
All I can say is that it just, I guess China was too polite in the past, maybe, so the West are not still not used to it, right? So,
Well, Westerners are not used to it from anybody. The Western powers, the Western culture is that they can be as rude and as aggressive towards anybody as they
mhm,
wish, and that's fine
mhm,
because they're the people who are allowed to be that way. But heaven forbid that anybody should talk to them in the same way. I mean that's what they don't like. I mean, and they find completely unacceptable. Like, they can interfere in anybody else's internal affairs, but if anybody else interferes in their own internal affairs, that's shocking. They can sanction anybody they want, but if they themselves are sanctioned, we've discussed this before,
mhm,
then that is absolutely outrageous. And that's absolutely the style of Western diplomacy and Western political thinking. And the extraordinary thing about it is that it's so much taken for granted here that people don't even think about it. It's not something that's even discussed or talked about in the West at all, even by people who are critical of Western policy in the West.
mhm. Yeah. But there has been very little negotiation at least we know of going on between China and the US, right? So there has been two articles talking about the meeting, potentially a meeting between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. One is the South China Morning
Mm,
Post. They were saying that Trump expressed interest or even made it clear that he would like to meet Xi Jinping within 100 days, after he come to office. Well, that would put it somewhere in April. So is it possible? So there's,
mm,
they call it insiders saying there is a possibly a meeting in April, which um that the first, I think Trump want Xi Jinping come to Mar-a-Lago, but China think Mar-a-Lago is not very formal. So that has been some discussion whether it's going to be in Washington.
mm,
Well, and then Wall Street Journal had an article saying that there is possible, they call it the birthday summit in June because
mm,
both Donald Trump and Xi Jinping's birthday is in June. So Trump's birthday is June
mm,
14th. Xi Jinping's birthday is June 15th. So one day apart, but both in June. And so they're
mm.
going to have some kind of a celebrate birthday. So that's why it's called the birthday summit. But that's look like a China want, if that's the case, according to the Wall Street Journal, is that it's going to be in China, that Trump is going to visit China. None of them is confirmed by either side. What is your take on
No.
all this talking? They're not
Well, I
denying.
mean, no, they're not denying. I mean, the first thing to say is that it's very much in the style of Donald Trump, and again, he does this, I think, without understanding that rushing into a meeting with someone like Xi Jinping unprepared is an extremely bad idea. Logically, if there's going to be a meeting at this level between leaders, it should be prepared weeks in advance. There
Mhm.
should be a clearly agreed agenda. There should be topics that each side knows that they wanted to talk about. There should be attempts by the officials on each side to meet and to try to iron out the agenda and to see whether, even before the meeting, there's any progress that can be made so that when the leaders meet, they don't have to spend hours and hours discussing over points that could have been agreed at a more less senior level.
Mhm.
Um, this is completely the wrong way of doing things. April, I think, is far too soon. Actually,
Mhm.
I think the best thing to do is to wait until June. Forget about the fact that they just have birthdays on that. That's just chance. I know. I mean, I don't know whether birthdays are taken seriously in China. I don't know that aspect of Chinese culture, but I cannot imagine that Xi Jinping is going to time summit meetings with world leaders around the date of his birthday. I mean, that isn't how uh, the Chinese government, I'm sure, works. So June is a much more sensible time to have a meeting. Prepare it carefully in advance. Even June, given how complex the relationship between the United States and China is probably a fairly short time.
Mhm.
I would have thought July, August, perhaps better actually. But all right, June. Um, get your staff together, sort out your team, meet with the Chinese, decide where the venue is going to be. It might be in China. I personally think it should be in China rather than the US because it's
Mhm.
the US that's asking for the summit meeting. So since it's the US that's asking for the summit meeting, it makes more sense to me that the US should be traveling to China rather than the other way around. I mean,
Yeah.
that seems to me the normal protocol. Perhaps if you don't want to have it in Beijing, well, there's plenty of other places in
Mhm.
China where you can have it too, and have a proper, serious discussion as one leader to another. And, not just as Donald Trump coming along to meet his old friend Xi Jinping, and they sit down together and have tea and talk about all sorts of things that they might agree with, and then they all go away and nothing happens.
Well, that I think Trump still
I
has,
don't. I don't think Xi Jinping would ever. Yeah, I don't think Xi Jinping would ever agree to that kind of summit.
yeah,
Just to say, I
yeah.
mean, quite apart from anything else, he's not going to waste his time in that way. But also, he knows that if a summit like that were to happen, there is a risk that it could make the relationship worse.
Hmm. Trump still believes in his personal touch on things. I find
Yeah.
that. So the reason he didn't think you need a lot of preparation is that he feel like, okay, I walk in there, problem solved. He still, I think he's still down to it. He still believes that. I think. Whereas China
I,
is much more like different levels discussions, right? Down to the details, and more or less we'll agree on things. And then finally you have the top leader meets and sign agreements, and etc. So very different approach on things.
completely different approach. And
Uh-huh.
it's not just Donald Trump. I mean, definitely he thinks like this. One of the very concerning things, not just about this administration, but about the recent run of administrations that we have had, is that um, because the United States gave up on diplomacy 20, 30 years ago,
Mhm.
they don't know how to do it anymore.
Mhm.
They don't know how to negotiate at a superpower level anymore. They seem to generally believe that you could just have quick meetings and everything can be agreed and sorted out, and then you can move on and everything will be well. You see the same with the Russians now, by the way.
Mhm.
They don't understand that negotiation has to be conducted in a very careful and patient way. You can't just go in and expect that you come in, meet Xi Jinping, you spend a few hours together, everything is sorted out, and you go back home, and there's a huge parade, and everybody cheers you, and the sun rises, and the clouds disperse, and everything is well. It doesn't work like that. It certainly doesn't work like that with China. I mean, anybody who thinks it does doesn't understand China at all.
And the other thing is about the Taiwan, and of course, because Wang Yi called the Taiwan, clearly stated, it's a province, and also combine that with not that long ago, China sent its 055 destroyer fleets around Australia and stuff like that. So all that things, and so they get lots of
Yeah.
people domestically inside China, the Chinese social media are talking about it. Is it countdown now to the unification? Because let's face it, Xi Jinping most definitely would want to get it done before he leaves office. That's, I think, everybody agree on
Mm.
that's going to happen. Now, Xi Jinping is 71 years old. He's still young, relatively speaking. Okay. So he still have plenty of time.
Yeah.
But there is also speculations that it probably won't wait until the next US administration, meaning within the Trump administration. That seems like where the time frame is. What do you think of that?
Well, I don't know, and I don't want to try and guess as a person from Britain what
Hmm.
China's timetable is. But let's unpack a few things here. China calling Taiwan a province. What's new? Tell me what is new about that. Tell me how that contradicts. I mean, every single Chinese government, the government of the People's Republic of China, the Kuomintang government that was
Uh-huh.
existed before, the Qing government that existed before that, every single government of China, as far back as anybody can remember, has spoken of Taiwan as a province of China.
Uh-huh.
I mean, what is different?
Uh-huh.
Tell me what is different. Why should that attract global attention? I mean, it's absurd, actually. Now, about troop movements and fleet movements,
Mhm.
clearly China is showing its strength. And why wouldn't it,
Mhm.
given all these threats and warnings that we have been hearing? And if Xi Jinping and the Chinese authorities are saying, look, we have to now decide that this policy that we've had before of strategic patience is exhausted. We've now got to move towards unification and move much more quickly than we did previously. Again, why is that surprising?
Uh-huh.
Who brought up the question of Taiwan's independence? Not China.
Mhm.
It was brought up. It was brought up by the Western powers and in Taiwan itself. So, in light of that, the feeling in China, if there is a feeling in China that we've got to sort this out quickly, rather than let this thing fester for much longer, because it's poisoning the entire relationship between China and the United States and the relationship between China and the Western powers. And we've got to end this thing once and for all so that we can move forward as a united nation. Then I can completely understand that. But if that's the crisis that's coming, and it doesn't need to be a crisis, by the way, but if that is the crisis that's coming, I can understand how it's come about.
Yeah. Maybe I think it's this netizens just getting more and more impatient. I think there's a sentiment within,
Well,
yeah, I want to see this thing get resolved. Yeah.
I think there is actually, and I'm again, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, uh, by the way, on that point, and it's an important point that people need to understand, and people never do in the West, is that China isn't just Xi Jinping and his
Hmm.
officials.
Hmm.
It's what 1.2 billion people who have opinions, which
Hmm.
the Chinese government takes into account.
Yeah.
And they have very clear opinions on Taiwan. I mean,
Yeah.
you said to me on one of the programs that we did that you have never met a single person in China who has any issue about any doubts about where Taiwan belongs.
Yeah.
So any Chinese government needs to take this fact into account.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, on this one, the Taiwan problem, yes, it's absolutely unified. So when people are saying, "Oh, you should let the people in Taiwan decide," well, if Taiwan is part of China, you should let people in China decide, right? So, and you can't just saying, "Okay, people in Taiwan want this." Well, how about people in China? It is part of China. So, um,
Yeah,
anyway,
exactly.
yeah. South Korea's president Yoon. Now he is released now, but it's now
Mm.
totally clear to me it's not ending, right? He's still under investigation or something.
No.
Can you explain what's happening and what is going to happen next? Very confusing.
Well, there is a power. I think it's clear that there is a power struggle in South Korea between the old guard that are still supporting President Yoon
Uh-huh.
and are probably very deeply implicated in the coup attempt, and the I would call them democratic forces. Actually,
Hmm.
I mean I can't think of a better name to give them. The people who opposed him, the opposition parties, and as I said. The result is that President Yoon himself has to some extent become a pawn in this game. And it's far from resolved. And clearly, I mean, there's powerful conservative forces in the judiciary, in the military that still are sympathetic to President Yoon. But I would have thought that over time, given that the South Korean people have made their feelings about him very, very clear, eventually this will be resolved in a way that ends whatever position he still has in South Korea. But it's going to be a long process, and probably it will require further elections and further presidential and parliamentary elections to resolve. And that always assumes that there won't be any outside interference in this process, which I'm afraid there may be.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No outside interference. It's almost impossible nowadays. Um,
In South Korea, absolutely, very difficult. I mean,
yeah,
given how involved the United States is in that country.
yeah. And also the Philippines, former President Duterte, he is now arrested, also facing trials in the ICC. He probably is on his way to Hague or something. That was surprising to me that Marcos would actually do that. I think in terms of the ICC, isn't that kind of a national sovereignty thing? But what is going on there? Philippines just a lot of infight as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't think there's any doubt about this. I mean, Duarte, a complicated man, not always perhaps a person that I would support on everything that he did, but certainly somebody who made a point of his independence from the United States, from the whole Western global system, who sought good relations with China. And he's now running against, he's finding himself victim to the same kind of political persecutions and lawfare and all of the rest, and the instrumentalization, the weaponization of the ICC that we find with so many other political leaders who take their stand against the West in some form or other. And as for President Marcos Jr., well, I mean, he is clearly somebody who is just there to do the things that he's told to do. So it doesn't surprise me at all.
And Marcos family has a pretty brutal history, right? Didn't they assassinated Aquino in the 80s, right?
Absolutely, they did. I remember it very, very well. I remember, by the way, watching a Christmas party that the Marcos family had together, and I remember the young Marcos Jr. in that party, and I mean, it was the vulgarity and grossness of it all was already staggering, actually. And I remember thinking at the time, I mean, what kind of a person is this boy going to become? Well, we now see. I actually remember thinking that when I watched it. Yeah.
Okay, now we find out. Okay. Um,
Yeah.
the Middle East. Okay, so Syria just had a massacre. I don't find any alternative word for it. It is a massacre against the Alawite.
No. Yeah.
Numbers ranging, some reported 1,000, but then others saying 7, 8,000 and in a number of days. So is it really surprising that this happened?
It's not just not surprising, it is completely predictable.
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
if you look at the character, the nature of the people who gained power in Syria in December, it was only a matter of time before something like this happened. And there'll be a lot more of this.
And the what's the guy's name? Al-Giani. I mean, he changed his
Al-Jalani, yeah, Al-Jalani.
name. Yeah, he
Yeah,
changed his
he's now
name.
President Al-Shara.
Okay, Al-Sharaa. Okay.
Yes,
Now they're part of they used to be at least part of the Al-Qaeda. But why
yeah,
Al-Qaeda, ISS? I mean, they're part of that people, but yet the US has
yeah.
supported, right? Knowing full well
Mm.
this is what kind of people they are, but the US
Yeah.
supported them openly.
Ab- Absolutely. So, firstly, he was a member of ISIS, a
Mhm,
senior member of ISIS.
mhm,
He was a friend and acquainted with al-Baghdadi, who was the leader of ISIS, the man who declared himself caliph, if you
mhm.
remember, in Mosul. Then he was sent by al-Baghdadi to Syria. He's from Syria to try to organize, a branch. This is before ISIS was set up. It was at that time al-Baghdadi was still a member of al-Qaeda. So he went to Syria, organized al-Qaeda, received financial backing from al-Baghdadi in Iraq, eventually began to distance himself a bit from al-Baghdadi. Then when al-Baghdadi fell out with al-Qaeda and made himself caliph, al-Sharaa transferred his loyalties to al-Qaeda instead. They continued to back him. Then ultimately he split with al-Qaeda and became his own man. But his views have always been the same. He's always been this kind of militant jihadi. The thing that I think separates him from Al Qaeda and from ISIS is that much more openly than those two terrorist organizations, he has aligned himself with Turkey and is very much Erdogan's man. So I think that's really the only difference in terms of his outlook, his beliefs. It's exactly the same, but he's loyal to Erdogan. Erdogan is his prime backer, and therefore he's susceptible to control by Turkey. That's all.
So why is Erdogan support him just to against the Turks inside Syria?
Yes, Erdogan has two reasons. Firstly, he wants to break the power of the Kurds in Syria. He's very close to achieving that, by the way.
Hmm.
But he clearly wants to break the power of the Kurds in Syria. He's also had long term plans to extend Turkish influence into the Middle East. He's often spoken about Syria as a former province of the Ottoman Empire, and he's been obsessed with this. So, I mean, the neo-Ottoman policy that he talks about and all of that.
Um, and the both in this case, the Russian and the U.S. called for a UN emergency meeting. What do you think is their goal
Yeah.
here? What can they achieve then here?
Very little, I suspect. And I think we need to understand two things. Firstly, the Russians, despite the fact that they still have their bases in Syria, are
Hmm.
not going to intervene militarily in Syria to try to
Hmm.
bring this process to a stop. I mean, I think that since the fall of Assad, they don't have anyone in Syria that they can work with in the way that they could work with Assad to try to maintain some kind of stability there. So they're not going to intervene militarily. The Americans, if anything, are leaving Syria. So I think that these are two superpowers that are withdrawing from the country because it's broken and they each understand that they can't either by themselves or working with each other put it together again. So this is a rhetorical exercise by the Russians and the Americans to condemn what's happening, but it won't change anything on the ground.
Well, if the US and Russia both leaving, well, then what's left is Turkey and Israel. Then they're going to divide
Correct.
Syria somehow.
Or, or come to conflict in
Uh-huh.
Syria with each other. And
Okay.
this is something that they're each worried about, And one of the odd things that's happened over the last couple of weeks is that because the Turks and the Israelis, I mean, the rhetoric between the two is escalating all the time. The Israeli government are saying that the government in Damascus is a government of terrorists. They're bombing large parts of Syria. They're enlarging the territory that they are already control. The government in Damascus, al-Shara and his people, are complaining about this, but they're not in a position to do very much. Turkey is worried that it's drifting into a conflict with Israel. Israel is worried that they're drifting into a conflict with Turkey. So, very interestingly, both al-Shara, the Turks who back al-Shara, and the Israelis are all asking the Russians to stay because they think that if the Russians stay in Syria, that will introduce into Syria a powerful third party which might be able to mediate between them and prevent the situation escalating out of control. I get the sense that the Russians themselves are very unsure whether it really makes sense for them to stay.
Hmm. In the meantime, Trump, I just read Trump administration has told Egyptians that they're going to cut their military aid because Egypt opposes Trump's plan to transfer the people from Gaza to Egypt.
Yeah.
What's your take on that? The, they
Well,
want to
it's
force Egypt.
again, they want to force Egypt. I don't think Egypt can do this, by the way. I think that the Egyptian government is caught between a rock and a hard place
Uh-huh.
because they're very, very dependent on America for economic and military aid. And on the other hand, I think if they accept the entire population of Gaza, that will destabilize the
Yeah.
situation in Egypt itself. The government in Egypt is very fragile. It's a dictatorship that came to power as a result of a coup,
Hmm.
which overthrew the elected president of Egypt, who was, of course, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. So, this pressure on Egypt that the United States is applying runs the risk of destabilizing Egypt and creating a crisis there. And if that government falls, if the current government in Egypt falls, it's highly likely that what we will end up with is a government led by the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an ally of Hamas. In fact, Hamas started as a branch of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. Remember, Gaza and Egypt used at the time for a time to be united with each other. So this is a very dangerous game that the Americans are playing, and I don't know whether they worked it out actually.
And I mean, all this lead to just a lot of I guess, unsettling feelings about the whole Middle East, right? So, before we talk further, oh, I always forget to ask you, why is the Middle East called the Middle East? Who gave that name? The British called it Middle East?
The Brit The British did. It's entirely the British. The East, of course, is China, India, those places. The Near East, well, that's a nebulous and difficult subject. What is the Near East? Sometimes it's referred to, it's taken to mean North Africa, but people don't talk much about the Near East. Sometimes you see that expression. So the Middle East is the Arab world, and it all goes back to British imperial policies because the British wanted to control all of these territories, um, basically in order to secure their own lines of communication to India, which is, of course, the jewel in the imperial crown.
Hmm.
And so they divided the East into regions, um, regions on a British imperial map, without any regard to the feelings or histories of the people who lived there. And they
Mm.
said, yeah, this is the Near East because it's close to us, this is the Middle East, and then there's the
Far East.
Far East,
Okay.
which is, of course, China.
Okay. Yeah, but I mean, it doesn't make any sense, right? If you look at a map, like a
No,
east,
no,
middle,
no,
where in the middle? Okay.
no,
All right.
no.
All
We
right,
should
Europe.
avoid using these terms. Yeah, we should
Yeah,
avoid using these terms.
Europe. Um, Clearly the United States want to get out of the Ukraine war, but the Europeans want to
Yeah.
continue, right? But it seems like
Mm,
even the Europeans, they are not unified. It seems for some
no.
reason, Macron is really not want to take in charge here. And of course, Stammer is also really very supportive, want to continue. Germany, I'm not sure because maybe because they had elections. But Meloni, Italy, she made it very clear she's not going to send in anybody or stuff like that. So there is I think, a divide in the Europeans also, right? What's moving forward? What is going to happen now in Europe?
Well, the Europeans are completely divided between each other. I mean, Maloney can't stand Macron. There is a personal feud between them. I mean, they absolutely hate each other. France has issues with Germany, long-standing issues with Germany. Macron has had a difficult relationship with Olaf Scholz, and he's nervous about German rearmament, not because he thinks Germany is going to march on Paris, but because he worries that if Germany rearms, it will replace France as militarily the most powerful country in Europe. So they all have these issues with each other, and they're very, very far from united on this plan. Um, the British are obsessed with Russia, and they have this need to continue the war because they want to defeat Russia. Of course, they can't do it themselves. They want the Americans to do it, and they want the Ukrainians to fight it, but they want to keep the war going because they want ultimately to see Russia defeated. I mean, this is an obsession that the British have long had, and they're not going to give up on it. The French want to lead Europe. And the way they want to lead Europe is by uniting Europe again in a crusade against Russia. This is something, by the way, that European countries often get themselves into. They start crusades against Russia. It's not the first time. This is Macron's plan. The Germans are very uncertain what they want to do, but because they themselves are internally divided on these questions. But there is this deep-seated fear that you find in some parts of German society, particularly Catholic German society, of Russia and hostility to it. So they're rearming, but at the same time, they know that wars with Russia never end well, at least for
Mhm.
Germany. So they get to stay out of Ukraine. And Italy's basically the sentiment of its people is very pro-Russian altogether. So they're all divided with each other, and the Italians probably want to see the war ended as quickly as possible so that they can resume friendly contacts with Russia of the kind that they've always had. So this is the story in Europe.
I think U.S. and Ukraine just to talk about a 30-day ceasefire. Why are they still talking
Yeah.
about ceasefire? I thought Russia made it very clear they're not interested in any ceasefire, right?
Yes, yes, it's the usual story. It's been discussed many times that whenever there's a negotiation with the Russians, what the Americans first do is they negotiate with themselves and they negotiate with their allies, and they pay absolutely no attention to what the Russians are saying.
Mhm.
And then they come up with a proposal, which in more cases than not, the Russians have already rejected. And then they find to their astonishment that the Russians are going to reject it all over again. It is something that happens constantly. It is been an ongoing problem in in negotiations between the West and the Russians for as long as I can remember.
Yeah, just like you said, that the United States forget how to conduct a diplomacy, right? That they figure,
Yeah.
okay, this is what we think it will work, and then they just throw it on the table, like believing everybody will just take it. Like,
Exactly. I mean, what you do, I mean, maybe seeking a ceasefire is the proper objective. You get all the
mhm,
parties together, you begin negotiations. If the negotiations go well, then you agree a ceasefire. I mean, that's the way you do it. You don't do it the other way around. First, you have the ceasefire, and then you have the negotiations. That really doesn't make any kind of sense. I
mhm.
mean, but it's again very much the American style.
Part of the reason I think Trump's foreign policy is so chaotic is I find it that he himself personally, not that interested. I really think he's more, like you said, focusing on domestic things.
Yeah.
But so far, how do you see his domestic agenda? How do you feel the all these chaos? I mean, there's chaos going on in with the Doge
Yes.
and the
Yes.
whole you can we can call it probably some kind of a reform that Trump is pushing. What is your overall feeling about? Does he achieve anything?
Isn't it? Well, you know what it reminds me of, and I have to say this, it reminds me of Gorbachev in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. He's trying to do far too much, far too quickly.
Mhm,
And many of his ideas are good ideas. Much of what he wants to do, I would support, but he comes across to me, and as an old man in a hurry, as we say, in Britain. I mean, that is an expression we have, that he's trying to do everything at once, and you can't do it like that. He should have concentrated first on getting the foreign policy establishment under control, because
mhm,
that's where the danger to him came from. That was what created all these problems in his first term. He should have concentrated first on that. Then he should have had his negotiations with the Russians and the Chinese, and this should have been in order to stabilize the international situation, Taiwan,
mhm,
Ukraine, and all of that. And that would have been a task of at least, I would say, 2 years. I mean, not
mhm.
you don't achieve all of this in a few weeks' time. It's a 2 year negotiation with the Russians and the Chinese. So that brings us to the third year of his term. Then you start the more deep seated domestic reforms. That's when gradually you've worked up to the position of introducing tariffs and doing that kind of thing. Remember, if he sorts things out with the Russians, for example, he can lift the sanctions
Mhm.
on trade in Russian oil. That brings oil prices down. That strengthens the domestic economy in the United States. That would have put him in a stronger position. And then he starts reforms in the last year of his presidency, and at that point he prepares to hand over to J.D. Vance. That would have been a much more
Mhm.
systematic way of doing the things that he's doing. But as I said, he's an old man in a hurry. He knows he's only got 4 years, and he's trying to do everything at once. And he doesn't have a strong team around him. I don't mean that the individuals around him are not intelligent, but in order to carry out a reform on this scale, you don't just need clever people in few departments. You need to have basically a whole secretariat and chancellery and people like that who hold it all together at the center and work out all the various plans. And of course, he's shown no interest in creating a body of people like that at all.
And it seems like he himself changed his mind all the time. Like just to look at the tariffs, right? I think it's much better if he's going to have a tariffs that he, like you said, he believes in tariffs. Well, then whatever the tariffs he wants to put in, then put it in, and that's it. But he's like, oh, put in, oh, maybe not. This sector get exempted, and then maybe 30 days, and maybe again, just seems like it's worse. This is the worst case for like the stock market and for economy in general because it's so unpredictable. Day one to day to
Yes.
from today to next day. What exactly his policy is, right? Very chaotic. He can't
Yes.
make up his mind.
I completely agree with this. I think, again, if you want to move the United States in the direction of tariffs, then you've got to prepare the ground very carefully because this is such a radical change in the whole nature of economic policy in the United States since the Second World War that you have to prepare methodically and systematically. You've got to have it all planned out. You've got to set up economics departments that look into all of this. You've got to consult with business. You've got to do it as part of an overall plan. America doesn't do plans anymore. It
Mhm.
isn't just Trump. The Americans have lost that skill. Once upon a time, by the way, they did planning very well. Just to say, it's an underestimated and misunderstood fact
Mhm.
about the United States that they left everything to the market. That isn't true at all, actually.
Mhm.
But um, over the last 50, 60, 70 years, those skills have atrophied and they're no longer there anymore.
Yeah. And also between, I think, within the MAGA movement, um, do you think there is a tension there between the blue MAGA versus the red MAGA? Which I think is new because the last time
Yes,
when Trump was in office, he was more or less just a red MAGA, Bannon, Steve
yes,
Bannon people. But this time he brought in Elon Musk, which is many people call it the blue MAGA.
yeah,
Okay. And there has been
yeah.
reported that Musk has first of all, some problems with other cabinet members. So for example, Marco
Mm.
Rubio and Duffy, the transportation minister, I mean, secretary. And so there's already argument there. But then also Steve Bannon made it very clear he doesn't trust Elon Musk, for example. So this, I think there is divide there, isn't it?
There's a huge divide and it's going to grow. And again, if you push these things too fast, they inevitably will grow wider. Sooner or later, and I'm going to say this, I think Musk is going to be sacked. I
Yes.
cannot see how this
Mhm.
can be avoided. He's making too many enemies, and Trump himself is going to see him as a problem.
Mhm.
He's been given far too much power in the
Mhm.
administration, and it's leading to outcomes that are politically not good for Trump and perhaps for the United States altogether.
The Republican Party is not doing what they're supposed to do either. And notice that they don't even have a budget yet, right? They
No,
by law they should have a budget like last October they should have a budget, but they still don't have a budget.
no,
I think they just passed a temporary spending bill, which is not the budget, right?
no,
So are there anybody really in control of the government?
no.
I mean, they are process. They need to do things.
No, they are not in control of the government. When one person is trying to do everything, no one is doing anything. One person is trying to do everything. That's Donald Trump. He's trying to settle Ukraine, sort things out with Xi Jinping, rearrange the Middle East, transform the United States. Again, as I said, it reminds me a bit of Gorbachev, actually. Um, uh, Things don't work out like that. That's why I said you need to have a proper chancellery or secretariat working for you. You need to prepare very carefully and systematically. You need to put all the right people in the right positions, and if you do that, and you're prepared to work 15 hours a day, and you plan your day carefully, and you set your objectives wisely, then you can achieve a great deal if you've
Mhm.
got momentum behind you. But if you do it in the way that is being done now, then, as I said, more likely than not, things will start to break down. I have to say this, to me, Trump is increasingly looking like America's Gorbachev. Like
Mhm.
Gorbachev, he understands that the previous direction that America has been following is unsustainable, that it will lead to a crisis. He's trying to reform the system and its foreign policy, sometimes in a very idealistic way, which is very like Gorbachev again, in order basically to preserve the system. But what he's actually doing is he's disorganizing and destabilizing it.
Yeah, and even some of his ideas, I mean, it's good that the Pentagon is, we assume that it's going to get an audit, we will see.
Yeah,
But then the latest spending bill, they increased the military spending again.
yeah.
So, so exactly what is he trying to do? I don't understand. I mean, it's good to have audit. Absolutely, we need to have an
Yeah.
audit for Pentagon. But then in your spending bill, the controlled by the Republican, they increased the military budget again. It seems like, is he doing a reform or not? Or is it just the surface, like a window dressing kind of a reform, right?
Well, it's not a reform. It's what you said. It's more chaos than reform. I mean, the underlying problem of the United States actually is its budget. I think one thing that's become very clear over the last couple of weeks is that the United States has lost control of its budget. By the way, the Soviet Union, it was exactly the same. Um, um, the Soviet Union had a succession of weak leaders. They didn't have that ability to sit down and work things through for 15 hours a day, as a leader does have to do. And so, starting from the late 1960s, but getting particularly bad by the late 70s, 80s, there was no longer any proper budgeting anymore. In the United States, it's much worse. The damage actually is far greater than it was in the Soviet Union, because in the Soviet Union, a smaller economy, and it didn't have the reserve currency. The US
Mhm.
has the reserve currency, which has enabled the process to go far further. So we have situations where apparently the president himself doesn't know about. I think we discussed it in a previous program, where was it a third of spending goes. I mean, it's so what Trump needed to do, as I said, he needed to get control of the security services, which were completely out of control in the United States. Um, Entities like USAID and all of those. That he absolutely needed to do. It's the one thing he's done reasonably well, by the way. He needed to spend time stabilizing the international situation. And then he did need to conduct reforms. And one of the most important was he needed to get to grips with the problems of the budget. But that needs, again, very hard work. It needs people like uh, a good treasury secretary,
Mhm.
obviously. It
Mhm.
needs a good team in the treasury. It needs, I have to say, a degree of cooperation in Congress, which would be very difficult to obtain at any time. And it needs also honesty with the American people, telling the American people, this is an unsustainable situation. It's not that we are overspending. Uh, we're overspending even more than we think, because we don't control our budget anymore. We are probably spending money we don't even have.
Mhm. And the one more thing I'm disappointed is the freedom of speech. I thought he's better than the Democrat, but lately they just arrested a Palestinian activist, Mahmoud Khalil.
Mm.
I don't even know why he needs to do that. He make it sounds like this is such a big deal. I mean, doesn't he have enough things for him to do to
Well,
focusing
yes.
on this one person? I don't
Well,
get that.
well, this is very much like Donald Trump. I mean, again, he doesn't understand that there are things that the president needs to do and which are important and which he needs to spend his time on. And, I'm talking about 15 hours a day at your desk, working very hard, meeting officials, doing all of those sort of things. And there are other things which can be left to take care of themselves because
Yeah.
they're not ultimately important. And it's again, it reminds me a bit of Gorbachev.
Mhm.
He used to get distracted by these things.
Okay.
Xi Jinping is not like that at all.
Yeah. Mhm.
Deng Xiaoping was not like that at
Yeah.
all either, if I can say. And to give him credit, neither is Putin. Putin has
Mhm.
transformed Russia, but he's done it in that very methodical, systematic way that we've just talked about.
Yeah. And they're the people who are working for this, it seems very clueless. They are still saying, like, oh, he's on a student visa, he's doing this and that badly. We need to deport him. The guy has a green card, actually.
Yeah.
So that got created a big panic in a lot of green card holders. Like, oh,
Yeah.
now they are going after green card, which is permanent residence.
Yes.
Right. And then there are people saying, well, they might not stop there. Maybe even if you're a citizen, you're not, safe. So it created kind of panicking feelings so unnecessarily, I find the whole thing. It's just getting everybody up in arms and unsettled and then highly critical of him for violating First Amendment and all that kind of thing. For what? What does he achieve for this whole thing?
Well, I mean, he keeps his friends in Israel happy, and he keeps
Okay.
his pro-Israeli friends in Washington happy, and some of the donors probably are happy as well. But it's exactly what you said. It's a president who's reacting to small pieces of news. I mean, he ought to be focusing instead on the underlying massive problems that the United States is facing. Problem is that the reality, the depth of these problems is not widely acknowledged in the United States.
Mhm.
It's not as if people in the United States, the great mass of people, are informed about them. They have a sense that things are going wrong,
Mhm.
but I don't think they know the extent to which they are wrong.
Mhm. Yeah. And also, I feel like sometimes they have the obsession, not just Trump, but his Israeli friends. Right now, I think they have an obsession against the Columbia University. Because
Yeah.
remember, they had a hearing for a few other universities, Harvard, Penn, UPenn, and maybe MIT. So I think all the other three presidents were gone. The Columbia one is the one who survived. I think she survived, and even though she wasn't a sympathetic to student at
Uh-huh.
all, but they still want to see her go. I think in the
Yes.
end, the Columbia board, I guess, decided that she did enough or something, so they didn't
Yeah.
let her go. I think some people just don't like that. They just want her to go, and since she
Well,
wasn't, so now they're creating troubles. I think that's part of that too.
you're absolutely correct about this. They're obsessed with Colombia, and not just even in Britain, you read these angry articles about Columbia University.
Hmm.
It shows what it demonstrates, by the way, is the insecurity of Israel's supporters.
Hmm.
So they're so obsessed
Yeah.
with punishing any university where there were student protests against what was going on in the Palestinian territories of any kind,
Mhm.
and it's completely out of proportion and it is completely counterproductive. But one mustn't excuse Donald Trump.
Yeah.
He's let himself be pulled along by all of this.
Yeah. Agree. All right. Canada, the new Prime Minister is Mark Carney, right? What's interesting is it seems like the Liberty Party seems like doing much better now, and there's
Yeah.
even some people saying maybe they actually can win in October.
Yeah.
That's changed fast. What's your take on that?
Well, there's two things. There's two things that have happened. Firstly, we've had this pressure from Donald Trump, and he's talking about absorbing Canada and all of that, and that's created a patriotic backlash. And the Liberal Party has benefited from it because the Conservatives are seen by many people as much too close to America and too
Mhm.
close to Donald Trump himself. So that is a factor not to be underestimated. Secondly, they've dumped a deeply unpopular and very polarizing Prime Minister, Justin
Uh-huh.
Trudeau, and
Mhm.
they've come up with a bland, or so they think, a bland technocrat, which is Mark Carney. People are saying, "Oh, what a huge relief! Now we got Mark Carney, and this is makes it possible to vote for the Liberals again." I saw this happen, by the way, in 1990 in Britain, when the Conservatives, who were very unpopular, dumped Margaret Thatcher, who was deeply unpopular at the time. I remember when she was forced out, I was in one of the London metro trains,
Mhm.
and it was announced over the public speaker that Margaret Thatcher had fallen, and everybody stood up and cheered. It was quite amazing to see, actually. Yeah, an event that people don't talk about much.
Mhm.
But she was replaced, and they brought in John Major, who's absolute bland technocrat, and people were overjoyed, and they voted for the Conservatives again. Um, they will regret it. Technocrats make very bad prime ministers, very
Mhm.
bad political leaders. They are not people who ultimately are able to hold things together for very long.
Now, it's interesting you're talking about Margaret Thatcher. I remember that too. It was a very dramatic. It was, in China. I didn't think we were expecting that. So
No.
he had a meeting in the EU, right? And somehow there was almost like an internal coup against her or something. Wasn't it?
Well, absolutely. That's completely correct. There was. She didn't like the EU. The Conservative Party at that time was very pro EU. Now, of course, it's very anti EU, but
Uh-huh.
at that time it was very pro EU. They got the sense that she was mismanaging relations with the EU, and so they got rid of her. But it was all a build-up of resentments and anger against her within the Conservative Party that went back many years, and she was very, very unpopular amongst people in Britain altogether. It's a
Mm.
fact that people don't realize about Margaret Thatcher. She was never as popular in Britain as people
Okay.
believe. She always had much more opposition, and she had obviously a very, very strong support base,
Hmm.
but I guess it was around 20 to 30% of the population, never more than that.
Isn't also David Cameron when he lost his job because the EU? It seems like this EU problem is a
Oh, yeah.
constant problem for the Conservative Party. They cannot make up their mind, it seems like to me.
That's absolutely correct. So you have this division within British politics. It affects both parties, by the way. Um, um, a large section of the British population is consistently hostile to the EU, has been throughout the entire history of its existence. Um, Particularly working class opinion is very hostile to the EU. And that creates problems for both political parties because they have one wing of the party that that's very committed to membership of the EU, and another wing of the party which is always very opposed to it. And it reflects the split within wider British society, which has always been there.
Hmm. Yeah, Theresa May, right? Wasn't she
Right.
also because of she
Yeah,
couldn't stand it?
absolutely. And there's another example because Theresa May also was essentially a technocrat, very capable administrator at the Home Office, our Ministry of the Interior. We use the expression Home Office to describe it. But she was very competent person managing it, but she completely failed as prime minister. She didn't have the political skills to lead the country in the way that a prime minister needs to do. I should say Mark Carney is somebody we
Uh-huh.
know very well in Britain because though he is Canadian, he was actually brought to Britain and became governor of our central bank for a time, the Bank of
Uh-huh.
England. And the result was that we got a very good sense of him. He was very, very close to the Labour Party. just
Okay.
just just saying.
Uh-huh.
And though, as I said, he's a technocrat mostly. He's a very political technocrat. He basically did whatever it was that the Labour Party wanted him to do. um, Most people think that he was pretty competent,
Uh-huh.
but not inspiring.
Mm-hmm.
And to be honest, I don't think he's going to be the right person to address Canada's many problems. He'll probably be very popular for a time, maybe about a year, 2 years, and then
Mm-hmm.
it will fade.
So you think if the Liberty Party wins in October, he will continue to be the prime minister and
Yes,
not
yes.
just transitional? Okay.
No, no, he will be the prime minister. If he
Okay.
leads them to victory, he will definitely be the prime minister.
Okay.
But as I said, um, his popularity is unlikely to last for very long.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Trudeau, whatever you may think of him, and I didn't like him at
Mm-hmm.
all, but he did have a kind of charisma,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
which I didn't understand
Mm-hmm.
myself, but which one had to acknowledge, which did reach out to many sections within Canadian society. Carney's not going to be like that.
Hmm. I, I find it's impossible for to find a perfect leader, isn't it? That
Well,
yeah,
the,
go ahead.
there is no such thing, and one should not look for one. But a good leader has to have certain skills. Firstly, the leader does need to have a feel
Mm-hmm.
for the sentiments of the people.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give an example from China. I mean, when Xi Jinping was moving towards the highest position, um, he understood that there were two issues that were very important to Chinese people. I mean, I'm sure there are many issues that are important to
Mm-hmm.
Chinese people. There were two that particularly interested them at the time and which weren't being talked about by other leaders to the extent that people in China wanted them to be talked about. One was pollution and the problems of,
Mm-hmm.
and the other was corruption.
Yeah.
And um, it, so he understood that. And he didn't just understand that. What made him successful was that he shared the feelings of his people
Mm-hmm.
about this.
Yeah.
And that gave him a connection, that showed that he had a connection to them. So that's an important quality of a political leader, that he has that sense of where the people are going,
Mm-hmm.
and he knows how to get ahead of that.
Yeah.
So that also, and I can't emphasize this enough, he has to be prepared to work very hard.
Yeah. 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 I mean, it's not easy to be a leader, right?
No,
It
no, it's not.
if
It's not easy, but it's also something that, again, a good leader enjoys.
uh-huh.
Somebody who hates it, somebody who
Yeah.
doesn't want to be a leader, who very unhappy doing this, is going to be a very, very bad leader. Is going to get distracted. Well, I mean, you have many examples of this in Chinese history. All those emperors, for example, in the past, who weren't interested, wasn't the one who, for 20 years, basically refused to do his work. Was it Wan Li? I mean, during the Ming Dynasty.
Wanli.
Well,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Wan Li. I mean,
Uh-huh.
you can't have leaders like that. I mean, that is a disastrous situation. So you have to have someone who has that sense of fulfillment
Mm-hmm.
that comes from strong government. And I mean, there are people like this, people who will work 15 hours a day and it becomes their vocation
Mm-hmm.
and their life. Now, Putin has that quality. Xi Jinping definitely
Mm-hmm.
has that. I mean, I know far less about Xi Jinping than I know about Putin, but I
Mm-hmm.
can tell you something. A man who is as well briefed as Xi Jinping, as well informed as he is,
Mm-hmm.
and as structured as Xi Jinping is a leader who works very hard.
Yeah, yeah. You simply have to put in the work. Yeah,
You
definitely.
simply have to
Yeah.
put in the work. It does, nothing happens by itself.
You can tell, actually, if you look at Biden, I don't think Biden enjoyed the leading part
No,
that
no,
much.
no.
I mean, he likes the privilege, right? Oh,
Yeah,
being the president of the United States. Of course, it's nice, but there's a lot of work to come with it. I don't think it's
correct,
Biden himself enjoyed that part, the
correct.
leading part.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean that is the other trap that many leaders fall into, is that they are become obsessed with the what in Britain we call the trappings of power
Hmm.
rather than its substance. The appearance. The bands that meet
Hmm.
you, the flags that fly when you appear, that kind of thing. If you become too interested in that kind of thing, then you're not going to succeed either. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, you can't ignore that completely
Hmm.
because again, the people want you to be dignified. They want to see you as a leader.
Yeah.
I mean, the people who turn up in bad suits and long fingernails, and they don't cut their
Hmm.
fingernails, and they let their hair run in all sorts of things. They're not going to impress anybody. Somebody who um, always looks dignified will always have authority, much more authority than someone who doesn't. But if you become obsessed with those things, if you
Hmm.
become obsessed with the ceremonies and the ritual, like
Hmm.
Brezhnev did in the Soviet Union, for
Uh-huh.
example, then
Yeah,
that's
he
not going
got
to
lots
work
of
well either. There's medals and all that sort of, so that's not going to work well for you either.
yeah, yeah. It's so easy though for lots of in particular today's world with so much media on all the
Yeah.
time. So lots of time they only pay attention to the surface, for
Yes.
the cosmetic kind of stuff, not
Yeah.
the concrete work, right? Which is the hard part, but
Yes.
they don't do that. Yeah,
Yes, I mean it's the
absolutely.
hard work that is the most important, but
Hmm.
you always do need to have that feel, that 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 sense of the pulse of
Hmm.
your nation, and you can always tell leaders who have it and those who don't.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. We can talk next time again, next Wednesday. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Have a great day, Sophia.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Right. Bye.